Okay, thanks, Pete. I see the red lights on and we're recording, so I'll go ahead and start. So we're going to look at some tools that you can use in your put in your land management toolbox. And so one of the uh, big questions we get frequently is about brush management. And so one of the things I think before you start to use a tool, you need to understand what your target is. And so, for example, this photograph here is showing what's below ground on a mesquite, and you'll notice that we've got right here is the soil surface, and so we've got these below the soil surface, we've got these dormant buds. If we remove the top of that mesquite, it's going to sprout, and those buds go down to the first lateral root. And so this, if we're going to control mesquite, we have to either get a herbicide to move uniformly into that bud zone or remove that bud zone mechanically. And this is another species that we get calls about or questions about controlling. This is red-berried juniper, and here we've got the bud zone that's right below the soil surface, and this is the reason that this species resprouts if we just cut it off. So again, we have to either get a chemical to move into that bud zone or remove it mechanically to control the plant. This picture shows mesquite nursery, and the point of this slide is that we don't talk about brush eradication, we talk about brush management or control. And this mesquite nursery was established in 1941 up in Spur, Texas, and they went in and they mechanically removed seedlings, and over a period of 25 years, we'll show you what they removed. So about every 5 to 7 years, they went back in and removed seedlings. So over the course of that 25 years, they removed 689 plants from that area, and that included 473 seedlings. So the point of this is that we can't eradicate brush, so we're in the business of managing brush if that's a goal. So one of the tools we're going to look at is chemical options that we have with brush management. And so, for example, we can apply these chemicals or herbicides from the air, either with fixed-wing aircraft or helicopters. And we typically, when we're doing it from the air, we'll typically use 4 gallons of spray volume. That doesn't mean 4 gallons of herbicide, but 4 gallons of spray volume to the acre. And then when we go to ground applications, we'll use a higher volume, 10 to 20 gallons, so we try to get good coverage. One of the options that we got, or one of the tools that we've got, is individual plant treatments, and these plant treatments are meant as maintenance practices. They're meant to use on low densities of brush and also smaller plants. And we've got several different approaches that we can take here. For example, in the upper left-hand corner, we're applying a stem spray to a mesquite. And then over here on the right, we're applying an individual plant leaf spray. On the lower left-hand corner, this is showing application of spike pellets to brush. And then we've got the cut stump application on the lower right-hand corner. All right, so we have a question here that y'all can participate in, and the question is, does the growth form of the brush affect the best choice of the management methods that we use? So if you'll just click yes or no on that, we'll see what what you all think. Okay, so we got 3 responses so far. 11, 13. It's like, okay, we got about 15 responses. So got some people that don't want to commit. 17. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll answer that question. Well, the answer is yes. very definitely affects the growth form. Very definitely affects what we can do. For example, with the single stem plant here in the top portion of the slide, we've got a lot of options. We can apply stem spray especially if the bark is smooth. We can do a leaf spray if the plant's small enough. We can do a cut stump. And then when we get down here to the lower right-hand corner, when we've got a multi-stem plant that's been disturbed, that's where somebody's gone in and taken the top of the plant off and it's resprouted. Our options are very limited. We really can't do stem sprays very effectively because it's going to cost us, we have to treat every stem and it's going to escalate the cost dramatically. And the effectiveness of treating these multi-stem plants with stem sprays is not very good. So it narrows our options when we've got these multi-stem plants. And one of the things that we need to look at is, when is a broadcast application appropriate versus individual plant treatment. And this is some data from Mesquite, and basically what we're showing here is until we get out here to about 300 to 400 plants per acre, these individual plant treatments, stem sprays and leaf sprays, are lower cost than we would have with a broadcast application. So with the broadcast application, it doesn't matter how many plants we've got, it's still the same cost across the acre. With the individual plant treatments, the cost depends on how many we treat per acre. So when we get out here to that 300 to 400 plants per acre level, we're looking at about a plant every 6 to 7 feet apart. So that's a pretty dense population of plants. Okay, another thing that we need to kind of consider with these individual plant treatments especially is how big is too big. And so in this particular picture, this fence line was sprayed from the inside of the fence, and we were able to cover part of the plant here, but we're not able to reach the plant on the other side. And so because of a tree's vascular system is not like our circulatory system, we spray on this side of the tree and we get movement into that side of the bud zone, but we don't get movement to the other side of the bud zone. So the herbicides don't go from the leaves down to the bud zone and then circulate back up through the plant. So that's why we need total leaf coverage to get the best effect on leaf sprays. So there's some herbicides that you probably don't want to consider using, or at least you need to be very, very cautious about using. And the two that are shown here on this slide are Velpar L and also Pronone Power Pellet. They contain hexazianone as an active ingredient. They're soil applied, non-restricted. You don't have to have a license for them. The best use is probably on cedar, but need to realize that this herbicide is mobile in the soil and it's non-selective. It means it doesn't care what plant it is going after or affecting. In fact, if you all remember, the treaty oak in Austin was sabotaged with Velpar. So it's a chemical that we need to be very careful with. The Pronone Power Pellet, one of the things that you hear about it is it's convenient because you've got this little pellet that you can drop on the ground. You don't have to have a specialized gun to apply the herbicide with, or specialized equipment. But you do need to mark where you treated. So when we've done this in experimental plots, we've carried a backpack with about a gallon of water with dye in it to mark the ground where so we know where we've sprayed these. The thing that I want to point out about the pellets is that on the label it lists species controls, and it says gives all these species: multiflora rose, myrtles, and then it says oaks, and it says except live oaks. And that the fact of the matter is that's not true, because this particular herbicide has the same active ingredient as Velpar, and Velpar is effective in killing oaks. And so we're going to look at this next slide here. In this lower left-hand corner, we've got a cedar that was treated with Velpar. Let's see. Well, okay. Sorry. Forgot what button to push. Treated with Velpar, and you can see that it's affecting that plant. But it's also that Velpar is also being picked up by that oak in this picture. So that cedar was treated too close to the oak, and so you've got to stay 3 canopy diameters away from a desirable plant if the terrain is level. If it's slope, you have to stay even further away, because the Velpar is mobile. The hexazinone is mobile in the soil. So this is a herbicide that you want to be very careful with, and another one that you want to be careful with is Spike, which is another soil-applied herbicide. The active ingredient is tebuthyron at 20%. There's another formulation that's Spike 80DF, 80% tebuthyron. Again, we see that it's non-selective here at the bottom. This formulation does allow us to do ground broadcast treatments, but it is non-selective. And in the next slide here, we're looking at Spike that was used too close to an oak tree. And so, in fact, in our control guide, if you wanted to control oaks, like sometimes they need to do in deep South Texas, the Spike would be listed as the herbicide that you'd use. So these 2 herbicides, the Velpar, Pronone Power Pellet with hexazinone, and the Spike, these are ones that you need to be very, very careful with, because they have side effects. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a minute and see if anybody has any questions. You can type your questions in the chat box, and we'll see if we can answer them. And if you don't have any questions right now, you can type them in as you think of them. We'll answer them later on in the presentation. Okay, it doesn't look like anybody has any questions right now. So we're going to switch gears, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Russell, and I'm going to silence.
Thank you, Dr. Lyons. Really good insight that you provided. I appreciate it. Another option or strategy or even tool that we have as range managers is the use of mechanical equipment to achieve specific goals with some type of desired outcome in mind. And knowing exactly the type of mechanical equipment to use is very, very important. But also equally important is knowing and understanding the growth morphology and specific species of the plant that you are looking to manage or target. And so we have another question for you, and that is, does proper identification of a plant species affect the best choice for brush management methods? And this is a polling question, so if you could just click yes or no, very similar to the last one that we did. We've got 13 voting so far. Most of you looks like are leaning towards yes. Pretty straightforward question, not looking to throw any trick questions at you. And we'll go ahead and move forward, and the answer is yes, absolutely. So we cannot begin to manage our plant communities effectively if we don't know how they grow or the type of rangeland ecological site that a particular species will grow or thrive on or potentially invade. And so we really need to know as much as possible about that target species before we invest the time and the money and the energy into any particular management plan. Okay, so doing your homework and being prepared for any tool that you use is key. It can save you large amounts of money if you can successfully pair that target species that you're looking to manage with the most appropriate management tool. And this will be obvious when you transition into a follow-up brush management strategy. Remember, like Dr. Lyons said, it's not just eradication that is even possible or that we're after management or control. And so the one example that I like to use are two popular species throughout the state of Texas. And now they are both juniper species or cedar, more commonly referred to as, but are they the same? So one is Ashe juniper or blueberry juniper, and the other is redberry juniper. And the answer, as many of you probably got right in the polling question, is no. So they are nowhere near the same. So understanding the growth morphology and the type of species that you're dealing with is crucial to applying the right management tool that we have available. Blueberry or Ashe juniper generally has a single basal stem growing out of the soil surface, and then it branches into those multi-stems. So in other words, it does not resprout from below ground basal buds. On the other hand, redberry juniper is the exact opposite. Redberry juniper is a prolific resprouter with many stems growing out of the soil surface. And this is very similar to the mesquite growth strategy that Dr. Lyons mentioned earlier. So here is another question for you. Does redberry and blueberry juniper like the same ecological sites? Do they like similar plant communities or soil types? Can they grow together? And as you look at this picture, ask yourself that, because the answer is yes, very much so. So throughout parts of the Edwards Plateau and in west central Texas, it is very common and easily found where you can find a mix of these same species growing side by side together. And sometimes it's pretty difficult to tell these two apart. So as you're driving down the road and you see a picture that's similar to this, you might think it's just the same species, when in fact, not only are they two different species, but they're two different growth strategies altogether. And it's very difficult to tell these two apart by the stems, and you can always check for the tell-all sign that redberry juniper has. And again, that's the resprouter species. Redberry juniper's leaves have these resin-producing glands that look like white specks on the leaves, and the leaves grow. These are the white specks that we're talking about, and these are very visible with the naked eye. So this is nothing you have to put underneath a microscope to tell. Redberry juniper's leaves are also really dark. They're very slender, thin, and sharp pointed, and the fruit is commonly red or that reddish brown when mature. So if we're managing for wildlife in any given area, and I know this is going to depend on some certain specific parts of it, but generally speaking, how much brush should be left in the area or in the pasture that you're looking to treat or potentially manage? And our options are 10%, 20%, or 40%. And this is a good question because some folks are checking 10%, others 20, some 40. Again, this is a very general, broad question. And as we move on to the answer, we can tell that when we are when there is a brush management mission, we sometimes forget that many of our target species are also native species and provide numerous benefits to wildlife. So how much is too much or too little? Of course, the answer depends on the target species of brush and the desired wildlife that you're managing for, but for the most part, we want anywhere from 40 to 50%, give or take. Of course, that's a very general amount, both for wildlife and livestock grazing species. And so now that we know what to look for when managing for brush and a general idea of hopefully the goals and objectives that you're looking to achieve by applying a certain technique or using a certain tool, how do we accomplish it? So what are the options that we have for mechanical options, and what exists out there? And a popular option, especially for resprouting species, is mechanical grubbing. Grubbing throughout the state of Texas can run anywhere from $130 to approximately $250 an acre. Those are, again, very general amounts and loosely based off of the NRCS estimates for those EQIP contracts that they have, and also our Texas A&M custom ag rates publication that we have available. But grubbing basically yanks a tree out of the ground, and you hope that you get all of the lateral roots. And this type of mechanical treatment is definitely an art and an investment in a good operator that can recognize those target trees from the non-target trees is key. So this is a very selective technique where you can pull out those invasive species and manage specifically for what you're looking to achieve. If you are looking to grub mesquite or any other hardwoods, we recommend a depth at a minimum of at least 14 inches. You might even have to go deeper than that to remove all of those basal and below ground buds that exist, that's similar to what Dr. Lyons talked about. Another option that we have is using an excavator to pretty much do the same technique that was on the last slide. So excavator grubbing is very similar to just overall mechanical grubbing, but instead of using a smaller machine like a skid steer, you are using a much heavier duty equipment like an excavator. Again, this type of option gives you some flexibility in which trees to remove and maybe more desirable trees to leave or brush to leave, especially as it relates back to your overall ranch management plan. But with an excavator, an operator can remove larger, more mature trees, and it's also it's easier because it's heavier duty equipment. Another option that we have available today, probably not as popular as it used to be. I believe root plowing was probably more popular back in the 70s or 80s, maybe even early 90s. But nowadays it's not as popular of an option because so much topsoil is displaced and disturbed, and when you're root plowing, you're really disturbing that grass turf that exists. The other thing about root plowing, and it's pretty costly compared to the other options that we have. And with root plowing, it's also a non-selective option. So typically, if there is any root plowing being done, it's an entire pasture that's being treated, and it's from fence line to fence line. Another option that we have is hydraulic shearing, and that's pretty popular in the hill country area and in areas that have good soil and minimal slope and rocks in country that's not very rough. Shearing is popular with non-sprouting species, but this option can also work if you are implementing a cut stump spray method on those resprouting species like red-berry juniper. And so using that cut stump spray, you're removing the above ground portion of that target species, and you're cutting it at ground level, and hopefully preferably with a level cut. And then you're following back up with a herbicide mix of Remedy and Diesel sprayed directly and quickly on that remaining stump that was just sheared off. It's important that you do spray quite quickly or immediately after shearing that above ground biomass off, because we have research from Fort Stockton that has showed that the sooner you treat the stump with that herbicide, the more effective it is, especially in the long term, so 2 years post-treatment. Spraying within 30 minutes is almost pushing it, and we recommend that stumps should be sprayed immediately afterwards. So the sooner the better. If you wait and delay it, you're pushing that success rate or decreasing the overall success rate of that particular treatment. Raking and stacking is a common second step after grubbing or shearing or even root plowing, and this is basically a cleanup type method, cleaning up the site after an initial mechanical treatment has occurred. So this is the step that pushes everything into piles for either future removal off the site or future pile burning when you have more desirable conditions that are opt for burning and treating those piles. And last but not least, you can always work out your brush frustrations by hand. Hand cutting can run anywhere from $75 on up to $150. But I do want to caution that there is a threshold when you're using this option. So at, 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 at this threshold is when plant densities are under 400 plants an acre. So anything more than that is no longer really economically viable. So it makes sense to look into more cost-effective options when you are dealing with higher densities than that 400 plants per acre threshold. And again, if using that cut stump method, when hand cutting, those stumps need to be sprayed immediately after cutting in order to maximize efficacy and plant mortality. Very, very important. And that is what we have for the mechanical treat options for managing brush. I believe I did see one question that was typed into the chat box, and that was which type of juniper is the one that causes allergies? And oh, I feel you because I get those allergies too. And I would say both of them do. Dr. Lyons, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there isn't one allergy-friendly juniper cedar out there. They both produce pollen, and of course during those times of the year we're just going to deal with those cedar trees. So that's one more advantage to managing for your brush. Any other questions or? Okay. Looks like we have somebody typing. And Mr. Mullins says, what chemical is used for stump spraying? The chemical that we use for doing the cut stumps is Remedy, and that is or an active ingredient of triclopyr. And based on the diameter of what you're working with, that's going to be mixed with diesel.
My mic.
Looks like yes.
And I would say for redberry juniper, we can use a different herbicide. We can use Tordon 22K in water. But typically for most woody species, we're going to use, as Dr. Russell said, we're going to use triclopyr ester at about 15% concentration in diesel.
Yes, excellent. Good point. It depends on the species that you're treating. Dr. Lyons, it looks like we have a few more folks typing. I don't know if you want to move on or if you
Yeah,
want
we'll move on and we'll catch those questions as they get typed. Well, I guess let's wait for Barron's here. You go ahead and read it because it's your.
Okay. Dr. Barron Rector is our range extension specialist in College Station, but he has a wealth of knowledge across the state, and he typed that Ashe juniper or blueberry juniper is usually the cause for allergies from December to February, and that's because of the male pollen release, a yellow cloud in the sky above the plant, also noted as mountain cedar on television allergy reports that you commonly see on your local 10 o'clock news or something like that. Excellent, excellent point, Dr. Rector. Thank you, sir. Well, I know lots of you are still typing, but we're going to have plenty of time for questions throughout. So I think I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Bob Lyons to continue on with the.
Okay. Let's catch John's question here. Do cut Ashe juniper berries sprout easily, or do they have to pass through? They either way they can sprout easily. Okay, Kendall's asking about Weesatch, 4 foot tall, multi-stem. We can use P plus D in the early fall in water as at a 1% concentration. Okay, Pete, you can put that question back up there. Can we use livestock as a land management tool? And like I said, we'll catch some of these other questions later here. Okay, yes or no? All right, we got mostly yeses. We've got one no. Okay, so we got everybody. So we'll move to the next slide. Well, the answer is that we can, but it depends. It depends on what we're trying to do. But we can use cattle as a management tool. We can use goats as a management tool, and we'll look at this here. Management is the cornerstone for, or vegetation management, cornerstone for wildlife management, and grazing by domestic livestock can be a tool. And this example here on Matagorda Island, if we didn't have management of the vegetation there, the grassy vegetation there, basically you'd be writing a prescription to get rid of quail, because the grasses would be so thick that the quail couldn't establish feeding corridors and have all the different types of habitat that they need. So in that particular, that's an example of where livestock grazing could definitely be used as a tool. So to understand how we might use livestock as a tool, it's helpful to understand what grazing animals eat. And first of all, they're looking for green leaves. And this will become apparent. The reason for showing you this become apparent in the next couple of slides. The next thing that they look for is mature green leaves and then green stems. So we've got a theme here of green. They're looking for green. And then once the green's not available, then dry leaves, and the last thing that they want to eat is dry stems. So this is an example how one way livestock can be used. This is what was done here is that a black line was established here for a prescribed burn. And so the idea was they're going to burn the grass back here, but they first established the black line when conditions are good, and then they use the livestock here to maintain that black line, because they're going to come to the green. There's dry grass here in the background, and we've got green grass, young green grass here in the foreground, and so that's going to attract the cattle, and they're going to keep that graze down so that they can maintain that black line. So that's one use that we can see for livestock. Down in South Texas, in deep South Texas, down around Hebronville area, there's a native grass called tanglehead. And what's happening down there is that when some of these ranches have been converted from livestock grazing to wildlife, and the livestock's been taken off, tanglehead, which loves sandy areas, has become almost a monoculture on some of these ranches, and it's become a problem for wildlife management because it becomes it's a big featured grass, and so it interferes with the type of structure that for example, bobwhite quail and deer need. They need some open spaces, and so it takes up the open spaces and doesn't allow for all the kinds of habitat that the wildlife needs. So one of the things that we did, we looked at a project using patch burning, and so we established areas here that we would burn, had plowed areas around as fire guards, then burned the areas, and then we placed GPS collars on cattle that were turned in the area, and we looked at where the cattle went. And the idea here was we weren't looking to eliminate the tanglehead, but to manage the tanglehead. And so by using the patch grazing, we were hoping to attract the cattle to those patches, and uh, so have an area that was burned, say this year, then a new set of areas that was burned next year. So over a period of years, you'd have different age burns, and you'd have different types of habitat or habitat structure in the grass. It's tall grasses, shorter grass that would favor quail and deer habitat. And so the next slide, we can see we had 4 trials with the collars, and February was immediately after the burn, and there's no difference between the burned areas and the non-burned areas. Then in March, we have significantly more GPS points in the burned areas than in the non-burned areas. In the burned areas where we have this new grass that's popping up, and you can see over here on the right, the dots show you where the cattle were grazing. You can see where the brown dots are, that's where the non-burned areas were. And so in March and also in May, we had significantly more GPS locations in those burned areas than in the non-burned areas. And then in July, that effect started to disappear. But again, the idea here is to put pressure on the grasses in specific areas and help control the structure of the grasses in those areas. So as I said, in subsequent years, there'd be different patches that would be burned to create different types of habitat. Because, for example, quail need habitat that's short grass. They need bunch grasses to nest in. They need open areas to find seeds and insects in. So they need a variety of habitat structures even within a grassy area. And deer benefit from this kind of disturbance as well, because in those areas that are grazed, you're going to have probably have some forage production that would benefit the white-tailed deer. So again, the idea was to work on structure of the grass habitat, especially in terms of the white-tailed deer. Okay, so the question is, can livestock benefit wildlife? Well, there are no pat answers. No, in some cases there's benefits, and in some cases not. So there are situations where cattle are inappropriate, and circumstances where grazing serves a purpose, as the slide that we just showed you with the tanglehead. The grazing could serve a definite purpose there to benefit especially quail and white-tailed deer. So it depends on the situation, but it definitely has potential. So this is a study that was done at the Welder Wildlife Area down in South Texas, and they found that grazing increased diversity of species, herbaceous species, until there was a drought. That deer tended to be more sensitive to grazing treatments than cattle did. The cattle and deer diets were distinct from each other, and drought and stocking rate increased. When we had drought and increased stocking rate, that increased forb overlap between the deer and the cattle. So the recommendations that came out of that study were to use moderate stocking rate and a continuous or less intensive grazing system to benefit the white-tailed deer. So livestock and wildlife competition, this only occurs if food supplies are limited. As long as food supplies are plentiful, there's very little competition involved. But competition is most likely when we have things like very little plant diversity. There's not a diverse set of plants for animals to choose from. When there are too many animals in an area, when it's overstocked, and then among the same species. So that cattle are going to be more competitive with cattle, deer are going to be more competitive with deer, because their diets tend to be fairly distinct. There are periods when they will overlap, but again, unless food supplies are limited, that competition is minimal. So I remember when I was a kid seeing cartoons of with goats eating tin cans. So the idea is the goat will eat anything, and that's really not quite the case, but they are pretty versatile in their diets. So one of the things that we'd kind of like maybe to get goats to eat in the hill country is juniper, the Ashe juniper, or blueberry cedar, or even redberry if we could get them to eat it. So this is an example of goat pressure on some cedar, but the problem here, because the cedar is one of the least preferred brush plants that we have, in other words, they'll eat everything else first. When you see a situation like this, when you have a browse line like that, you know that the desirable woody plants have been pretty well nuked or hit pretty hard. So this is not a good situation in that regard. So one of the things that we've seen with studies is, why do animals, what's the difference in preference between redberry and Ashe juniper? And one study that was done showed that the major difference is one specific alcohol that's has a higher concentration in redberry than the Ashe juniper. So there are preferences for juniper browse, and the female ash is the most preferred plant, then the male ash, and then the female redberry and the male redberry. And so as you go to that bottom level there with the male redberry, you get more of that alcohol content in the plant. And then the other thing is growth stage preference. The needle leaf stage with cotyledons intact, and when you get to scale leaf, that's less desirable, and then that needle leaf without the cotyledons, it's less palatable, less desirable. So there are preferences there. So one of the things that you might ask is, well, how much juniper will a goat eat? And this is a study with Ashe juniper conducted at the Sonora Experiment Station, and the controls, they were able to eat about 0.6 of a pound per day. If they fed corn to the goats, that actually depressed the intake of the goats. And then when they fed protein as a supplement, that stimulated intake to about 0.8 of a pound. But the problem is that they found 0.8 of a pound, it would probably take a goat 2 weeks to eat a 4-foot tall juniper if the goat would stay on that juniper for 2 weeks, which they won't. So how do we use goats as a tool to control juniper? Well, one of the things that we need to understand is what the efficiency is. Goats will browse to about 4 to 5 feet tall plants. Spanish goats can browse higher than Angoras. They're bigger. And Spanish goats can browse in more dense brush because they don't have the Angoras can get hung up in with their hair. We don't have that many Angoras around anymore, but that's one of the issues that we've seen in the past. And in boar goats, we really don't know much about their efficiency. But the strategy is to give the goat a size advantage. So we want to concentrate the goats in about 6 to 8 goats per acre over a 30-day grazing period, and we want that grazing period to be in the winter when there's not a whole lot else that's green around, because we want to push the goats to that juniper rather than more desirable plants. And then we want to decrease that goat density during the growing season, so we don't put too much pressure on the more desirable browse species that could be beneficial to white-tailed deer, for example. Another potential use of livestock for management is with toxic plants. In some instances, and this is just one example, twin leaf senna is a toxic plant. It's very toxic to cattle and goats, and one of the ways that we can minimize that is by including sheep in the grazing mix, and in fact rotating sheep through a pasture that has twin leaf senna prior to rotating cattle and goats through the pasture, and that can decrease the potential for that toxicity. Okay, and that brings it back to questions, and I've got one question here from Ling. Is it because oil or alcohol that they don't eat the juniper? Yes, that's there. That alcohol or the resins limit the amount that they can actually handle, that the goats can handle in terms of juniper. Okay, so I think we answered the question about Weesatch. We'd use Grazon P plus D, or we can also use Sendero if you don't have a applicator license as a foliar spray, but you want to do that in the early to, we're probably too late to do it this year, but typically early fall is the times you want to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Russell to finish up.
Really appreciate that. Next, we're going to cover our last topic for the lunch hour. Really, again, appreciate all y'all tuning in, and thank you for the questions as well. But the last tool that we're going to talk about is the use of prescribed burning. And first and foremost, I want to just say that prescribed burning is not for everyone, nor is it for every situation. But believe it or not, fire played a crucial role back before European settlement. And we know that from historic fire estimates based off of charcoal samples, based off of tree rings, and this figure was published back in 2012 that show the historic fire estimates. Now this is strictly from 1650 to 1850, what the presence of fire looked like across the nation. And as you focus in on Texas, you can see that there was quite the diversity of fire regimes, including differences in fire frequency, more importantly. So the further west you got, or the more arid and limited the rainfall was, the longer the fire return interval was. So anywhere from 18 to 20 years in the western part of the state. But as you moved further east, you saw differences in that fire frequency, and you saw it go anywhere from burning every 6 or 8 years to every 2 years the further east you got. And that is strictly a product of the amount of rainfall and precipitation that falls across the state, and how much dense fine fuel can accumulate in one growing season. So fire played a huge role in shaping plant communities and also the resiliency of those landscapes. For example, that's why we have so many resprouting species. We oftentimes curse them. We oftentimes curse them a lot, but in all actuality, that was a growth form that resulted in the frequent fire that happened across the landscapes. So as we look at prescribed burning as a tool, there are some things that prescribed burning can do very effectively. For example, that Ashe juniper or blueberry juniper that we talked about is easily controlled with prescribed burning. And a lot of times we're targeting a tree that is 4 feet tall or smaller. And those are immature trees. And usually what happens when we see that size of a tree, we know that it hasn't completely overtaken a plant community. So it's not a solid monoculture of just blueberry juniper growing, and they're not mature trees. They're more immature than anything. Now, hardwoods and mesquite are a different story because those are those reef-sprouting species that we've talked about throughout the presentation. They can be suppressed with prescribed burning, but a lot of times if that fire does not get hot enough, or the duration of the heat isn't as long as we'd like it to be, or that heat transfer doesn't occur down throughout the soil profile, remember we're targeting those below ground buds on these re-sprouting trees, it will re-sprout. And most oftentimes that is going to require some type of follow-up method. Now you can always use fire or prescribed burning as your follow-up method, but those re-sprouting species are just a different type of growth form to deal with. And some research that Dr. Butch Taylor did out by the Sonora Experiment Station, he looked at differences in the diameter at breast height in terms of how large these trees were. And so he found that the percent mortality from both summer fire and winter fire decreased as those trees became more mature, or as they became larger in diameter. So they became more difficult to kill, primarily with prescribed burning. We have more research, or newer research, that comes from Dr. Ansley, who was a research scientist at the Vernon Experiment Station, and he published this work in Rangeland Ecology and Management a couple of years ago. But he saw that mesquite, which is a prolific reef sprouter, is capable of being killed by applying prescribed burning. And he looked at both winter fire and summer fire at different fine fuel grass loads, so at both 2,000 pounds per acre and then also 5,000 pounds per acre. And what he found was that if the seedling stage of mesquite is within about 3 years or less, okay, so if they're 17 months or less, it doesn't matter what season of fire you use or how much fine fuel you have available in terms of pounds per acre, you can achieve at least an 80% mortality on those mesquite seedlings. So fairly new, groundbreaking research, just further identifying fire effects and how fire has shaped our plant communities and will continue to shape them in the future. But before we really go much further, regardless if you use prescribed burning or mechanical treatment or even biological treatment, such as other livestock or even herbicides, you need to ask yourself, what is that management goal? What do you want that pasture to look like at the end of the day? What do you envision seeing? And what type of diversity would you also like to have on your pasture? I mentioned earlier that prescribed burning works very, very well in certain situations, and we know that because of the historic fire regime that occurred across this state. So for example, in this type of situation where you have more than adequate fine fuel and you also have consistent fuel continuity across the landscape, really dense patches of dried, cured out fuel, and it's also very consistent. And you also have these little minimal cedar trees, probably most likely redberry juniper. This picture was taken outside of Kerrville. And so when you see this type of scenario, this type of situation screams prescribed burning. The grass needs to be burned and rejuvenated, and then also you'll be successful in targeting these immature, smaller cedar trees. Now if we move on to the next scenario, a scenario similar to this one where you have inadequate or non-existent fine fuel, see these clumps of bare ground, and also that fuel continuity is also compromised. A very dense canopy or closed canopy of cedar, it's going to be very difficult to establish a fire and get that fire to carry through this dense and closed canopy of cedar. Now, I'm not saying it can't be done. There's been lots of work and research looking at summer prescribed burns and a much hotter fire, but those fires are typically generating the same effects as you would see in a wildfire type situation. And so it's a different type of prescribed burn that you're implementing. That being said, summer fires are historically when this country burned, or the predominant season that historic fires occurred at. So our plant communities are equipped with those resistant and resilient mechanisms to withstand those summer fire effects. Again, it relates all back to what you are looking to achieve as a range manager, and what type of signature you want to leave on the landscape and in your pastures as that land steward. There's lots of different options out there if you are looking to use prescribed burning as a range management tool. For example, the Natural Resource Conservation, NRCS offers much needed assistance through both technical assistance, where NRCS plans can write your burn plan and assist with the implementation of that prescribed burn. When NRCS employees are providing that technical assistance, you as a landowner are still liable. It's your name written in the burn plan as the burn boss. However, the NRCS can also provide assistance in the form of financial assistance, more commonly in terms of equip contracts. And so they pay you on a per acre basis to treat a certain pasture or approved pasture with prescribed burning, and it's up to you to get that burning done. So you may use a commercial licensed prescribed burn manager, you may use your local prescribed burn association, you may just burn it yourself too. There's lots of different options out there. But the NRCS has realized that prescribed burning is a very crucial range management tool that we have, but it's often overlooked. And so here recently they increased that payment rate on a per acre basis so that their clientele can hire certified insured prescribed burn managers, or hire PBAs, or even hire the contract work for installing the fire breaks, which is oftentimes the most expensive part of that prescribed burn. I mentioned prescribed burn associations earlier. PBAs, there are a lot of different PBAs throughout the state. Unfortunately, not every county belongs to a PBA, but the counties that do have those really thriving prescribed burn associations, it's all built on a neighbor helping neighbor philosophy. So we see lots of PBAs that also serve and work as volunteer fire department members. But it's all about rancher helping rancher, and very community based, and especially in tight-knit communities. In fact, the Edwards Plateau Prescribed Burn Association, that is based out of Sonora, was the first prescribed burn association started in the nation, and then all other states like Florida and Georgia used our model that we created here in Texas, that Dr. Butch Taylor created, and then they took it to their state. So that's where PBAs got their start. I mentioned earlier commercial and certified insured prescribed burn managers. What's really cool about these guys is that there are a lot throughout the state. You can find their information at texasagriculture.gov, but every single person that's listed as a commercial and certified prescribed burn manager has their own insurance policy. And not only do they have their own liability insurance policy that dissolves the landowner of any disasters or wrongdoing or any liability that occurs, negligence that occurs, but they also most oftentimes are turnkey operations. So they bring their own equipment, they bring their own personnel, and they get the job done from beginning to end. And most oftentimes the burn managers that I know of and I work with, they're very interested in the land management, and so it's a total team effort between that burn manager and also the landowner. And again, you can find a list of every single private and commercial certified burn manager from texasagriculture.gov. That's regulated through the Texas Department of Agriculture, very similar to how our pesticide license and applicator license are regulated as well. So that's going to do it for that portion, and also for the entire presentation. If y'all have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box. Unfortunately, Dr. Lyons has left us. He had another presentation to give at 1 o'clock, so he started that second presentation. But I would be more than happy to help you out. And also, Dr. Baron Rector is still with us today too. So between the two of us, I'm sure we can help you out. Charlie has a question, and his is about KR bluestem will increase with burning. Sir, that's a really good point. I would say we are still in the early stages of that research. We don't have all the answers yet, but I know the Kingsville folks, the research being done at Kingsville has looked at KR bluestem and looked at using KR as a patch burning scenario or a patch burning species. I have seen the bud bank on KR bluestem, and it is prolific. So any native perennial grass that has an extensive bud bank, below ground reserve of buds, and then also has prolific seed production as well, that's going to just be a very opportunistic species. So most likely that species will increase after fire. Again, we don't know what season of fire, we don't know what temperature or duration of heat of fire. It's still in its early form of research, but yes, what we do know. Dr. Baron Rector also added that we have examples of both increasing and decreasing in King Ranch bluestem. Again, that's because we are such in the early stages of that research on that specific plant. But Dr. Rector said that depending on many factors at the time of the prescribed burn. So again, the fire conditions that you burn during is crucial to these fire effects. How hot did it get? How much heat did you transfer down into the soil profile? How much soil moisture existed? How much fuel moisture existed? The cool thing about prescribed burning is that it's very much an art and not always a science. So really fine-tuning your goals and objectives as a range manager, and then applying the right treatment or the right type of fire is very, very important. Mike asked, Bahia grass, increase or decrease? I would say increase. Again, I have not conducted any research on that firsthand, but I believe that Bahia grass is a fire tolerant plant, and so anytime you have tolerance to fire, a lot of times what you do is you activate that below ground bud bank, and that's why we see a flush of green immediately after burning. And I don't want to be negative Nancy over here, but on the other hand, a lot of our native perennial grasses that are desirable species like side oats grama or little bluestem or even big bluestem, blue grama, buffalo grass, those species are also very fire tolerant as well. And so when you do put a fire across the landscape, what you're really doing is resetting that plant community and resetting all other competitive advantages. And so it's every man for itself when it comes to the grass response following fire. Another question asked about plains bluestem. Again, I do not have the research firsthand about that specific species as it responds to fire, but I would say since it is a bluestem species, it's going to be very fire tolerant. So again, it will activate all those dormant below ground buds, and we should see a positive response to fire. Now there is a fine line, so if you burn too often or you immediately graze after burning with a heavy stalking rate, you're going to see some species fall out of that plant community mix just because you've burned it too frequently or burned it too hot or you grazed it too hard. And so what you do after that fire is just as important as the management tool that you choose to use on your operation. Kendall's asking, is P plus D the same as Graze on Next? I thought P plus D was no longer available. I believe P plus D is available, but Kendall, if you type your email for me, I will make sure I get that answer to you for sure, and follow up with Dr. Lyons on that. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and I think I kicked out um, survey. If the survey don't come up, please fill it up, and we'll wait for some more questions. And as we sit here and wait for more questions, let me say our next session is going to be December the 7th. Dr. Tim Steffens is going to be talking about grazing with a purpose, manage for what you want. And if you're not doing so, you can follow us on Facebook under facebook.com/txrange. We normally post twice a week and some kind of educational post. So please follow us. See, Dr. Russell says Great Song P plus D still available. And then again, one more thing is if you're here for CEU credit, please type in your email address so we can make sure that we get all our records cross-referenced and you get your certificate. If the survey didn't pop up on your screen, please click on the link on the screen and you should get the survey. Any other questions?